well, this evening, my presentation is called Constructing an Optimal Plant-Based Diet for Preventing and Fighting Disease. And I would like to begin just with a brief outline. We're going to talk just a little bit about the strength of the link between diet and disease. We'll talk about why plant-based diets are so effective. And then the bulk of the presentation will be sort of the practical piece, 7 steps to an optimal plant-based diet for preventing and fighting disease. I want to start out with a story about my dad. And this happened in the late 70s. I was in university and I was studying health and nutrition. And I was home visiting my parents during a study break. And my dad was not exactly a health nut. So I was in the kitchen preparing some food. And my dad just loved to tease me about my interest and my passion for health. And he in one hand, had a bag of potato chips and a bag of licorice, all sorts. In the other, he had a big bottle of Coke, and he put 2 cigarettes in his mouth, and he sauntered by me, stuck his belly out as far as it could go, and I can tell you it was pretty far. And he turned to me with this cheeky grin and just smiled. And I, of course, gave him the look of disgust. But a couple of hours later, I went to him and I said, I just don't understand why you're doing this to yourself. Don't you want to be with us for a long time? And he said, to be honest, I would sooner live 50 years having the freedom to enjoy all of the things I enjoy in life than live 75 years and having to restrict this and restrict that. He said, you know, I could be hit by a truck tomorrow. And I responded, I know, Dad, but it doesn't mean you have to walk out in front of one. You see, this is what we know. We know that 70% of deaths globally are due to chronic diseases of our own making. We know that 90% of type 2 diabetes, 80% of heart disease, and about 30 to 70% of cancers are considered entirely preventable. And in 2011, the World Health Organization identified the 4 big lifestyle culprits, and they identified them as being smoking, drinking alcohol, physical inactivity, and an unhealthy diet. And they actually defined an unhealthy diet as one that is based on processed foods with added fat, sugar, and salt, and animal products rich in saturated fats. It's low in high fiber plant foods, such as vegetables, fruits, legumes, whole grains, and nuts. And if you'll notice, they actually identified 2 categories of foods that are most strongly associated with increased risk of disease. And they are processed foods and animal products. They identified 1 category of food that's protective, and that is high fiber plant foods. And they added that those at highest risk are inactive populations consuming Western style diets. The highest rates globally are North America, Northern Europe, Australia, and of course, developing countries that are adopting our Western ways. At the lowest risk are populations who live simply, are physically active, and consume unprocessed plant-based diets. The lowest rates globally are some parts of rural Asia, South America, and the people of the blue zones. And I'm guessing you might have heard of the blue zones, but if you haven't, these are places in the world where they have more centenarians than anywhere else, people that live to be at least 100. But what's really interesting about these long-lived people is that not only do they live a long time, but as they reach these advanced years, they are still active and productive in these regions. And there were actually 5 blue zones that were identified. One was Loma Linda, California. This is the Seventh-day Adventists in California, the Nicoya Peninsula of Costa Rica, Sardinia, Italy, Ikaria, Greece, and Okinawa, Japan. And what this man in this picture just astonishes me, because he is an Okinawan centenarian. So he is at least 100 years old. Now, there are common practices or lifestyle practices that are common to every blue zone that we know of. And these people have strong sense of family. They tend not to smoke. They are socially engaged. They do constant, moderate physical activity. And where diet is concerned, there are two things. One is they all consume plant-based diets, and the other is legumes are dietary staples in every single one of these populations. And there is a lot of evidence for plant-based diets, and we're not going to take time to go through the bulk of the evidence, but I want to give you a little flavor for what we know. And some of the most impressive evidence, in my view, are the studies that have followed similar health conscious people eating different dietary patterns. So some of them are meat eaters or omnivores. Some are pescatarians or people that eat fish. Some are lacto-ovo-vegetarians, meaning they don't eat any flesh foods, but they do include dairy and eggs. And some are vegan, or they eat 100% plant-based, no animal products at all. And what's really interesting is when they compare the omnivores to the vegetarians to the vegans, they actually control for things like alcohol intake, physical activity, smoking. So these people are all, smoking the same amount, drinking the same amount, exercising the same amount, and so forth. And what we know is for ischemic heart disease in EPIC Oxford, this is one of the big cohorts that we've been following for many years, since 1993. The ischemic heart disease was 22% lower among lacto-ovo-vegetarians and vegans. And in the Adventist Health Study-2, hypertension was 75% lower among vegans and 55% lower among lacto-ovo-vegetarians. Type 2 diabetes in the Adventist Health Study-2 was 62% lower among vegans and 38% lower among lacto-ovo-vegetarians. In EPIC Oxford, cancer was 19% lower among vegans and 11% lower among lacto-ovo-vegetarians. Cataracts were 40% lower among vegans and 30% lower among lacto-ovo-vegetarians. Diverticular disease was 72% lower among vegans and 27% lower among lacto-ovo-vegetarians in the EPIC Oxford study. Kidney disease in the Adventist Health Study-2 was 52% lower among vegans and lacto-ovo-vegetarians combined. And I thought this was interesting too. The risk of getting severe COVID-19 was 73% lower among plant-based eaters in one study. There have actually been 3 or 4 studies showing tremendous advantages for plant-based eaters where COVID is concerned. So why are plant-based diets so effective? Well, plant-based diets are so effective because they essentially put a lid on the drivers of chronic disease. Things like inflammation, lipotoxicity, which is when we store fat in places in the body where it shouldn't be stored, like in our vital organs, like our liver and our pancreas. Dysbiosis, which is unhealthy gut flora, oxidative stress, all of these things, when you eat a healthy plant-based diet, you literally put a lid on those drivers of disease. And of course, the most protective dietary patterns are those that minimize pathogenic dietary components and maximize protective dietary components. And when you think about dietary components that provide protection, we think about things like fiber and phytochemicals and plant enzymes that help to convert phytochemicals into their active forms, and antioxidants and anti-inflammatory compounds and plant sterols and stanols and pre and probiotics, and of course macro and micronutrients that come from healthy sources that contain all of the above. And the thing that kind of jumps off the page at you when you look at this list is these are all components in foods that are concentrated, either they are exclusive to or found predominantly in plant foods. So this is why plant foods are so protective. They're the most concentrated sources of the factors in food that protect us. And then we think of the pathogenic factors like trans fatty acids and excessive saturated fat, refined carbohydrates, excessive sodium, new 5-GC, which is a pro-inflammatory molecule in meat, chemical contaminants that move up the food chain generally, products of high temperature cooking. We'll talk more about these later. Pro-oxidants, things that cause oxidative stress, a TMAO or trimethylamine N oxide, which is an atherogenic compound that's formed from carnitine or choline, mainly in animal products, endotoxins, which are sort of the gram-negative, dead gram-negative bacteria, mainly in meat. So these components that are associated with increased risk of disease are found in those two categories of foods that the World Health Organization warned us about: highly processed foods and animal products. And the sad reality, of course, is that most of what consumers eat is a threat to their health. And the bottom line is we actually know enough. We know enough to make lifestyle medicine the treatment of choice for individuals with lifestyle-induced chronic diseases. And so the rest of the presentation, I want to focus on the practical pieces, 7 steps to an optimal plant-based diet. So we'll go through one by one. Step 1 is to make whole plant foods the foundation of the diet. So not plant foods in bags and boxes, but plant foods as they're grown, essentially. And this is not a diet, as you probably are well aware, it is not a diet of deprivation. It is a diet of variety and color and flavor and texture. It really is a delicious way of eating. So what we want to aim for is about 9 or more, preferably 12 to 14, that's about what I get, servings of vegetables and fruits a day. And you want the variety and the color in this category. You want at least 2 servings of legumes a day. And again, preferably beans, lentils, chickpeas, split peas, the less processed foods in this category. You want about 0 to 6 servings of whole grains a day, depending on your energy needs. If you're someone that needs a lot of calories, you're going towards the higher number. If you're trying to lose weight, you can eat no whole grains, or you can eat 1 or 2 servings a day, and that would be enough. You want to get at least 1 serving of nuts and seeds a day. These can be our primary source of omega-3s in a plant-based diet, so that's very important to ensure that. And then generous amounts of herbs and spices, which are fairly concentrated sources of antioxidants and phytochemicals. And of course, they also make food taste delicious. These are the foods, plant foods, are the only foods with fiber. And fiber is important. It's important for regularity and preventing constipation, but it's important for so much more. Fiber helps build and maintain a healthy gut microbiome because certain types of fiber provide food for our healthy gut bacteria. And if we don't have fiber, our gut bacteria don't have the food they need to thrive and survive. Fiber increases satiety, it reduces cravings, it reduces our risk of colorectal cancer, it can help to reduce blood cholesterol levels, it stabilizes blood sugar, it reduces our risk of GI disorders, it enhances immune function, and it lessens hormonal imbalances. So how much fiber do we actually need? Well, the RDA, or the recommended dietary allowances, are 38 grams a day for men and 25 for women. And to be precise, it's 14 grams per 1,000 calories. And so on average, it would work out to about that. Now, I believe optimal intakes, based on a lot of research, are more in the range of at least 40 to 60 grams a day. Actual intakes in the standard American diet are 15 to 17 grams a day. On a whole food plant-based diet, it's about 40 to 80 grams a day. And what may come as a big surprise to you is that Paleolithic intakes ranged from 70 to 150 plus grams of fiber a day. So there's definitely a long history of getting a lot of fiber in the human diet. Step number 2, and this is a really important one, is be very picky about your sources of carbohydrates. Carbohydrates, contrary to popular opinion, are not the enemy. Carbohydrates from whole foods are consistently protective to health. In fact, there was a study from 2018, and this was actually a meta-analysis of over 115,000 individuals followed for a median of 25 years. And they found that they actually looked at the relationship between carbohydrate intake and mortality. And people who consumed the fewest carbohydrates, so that would be people on, for example, a ketogenic diet, had the greatest increase in mortality, 32% increased risk of mortality compared to people eating more carbohydrates, or 50 to 55% of calories from carbohydrates. Now, what's really interesting is people at the highest end of the range, 80% plus, actually had a 23% increased risk of mortality. But there is a caveat here, and that is that people who actually experienced an increased risk with high carbohydrate intakes were getting most of their carbohydrates from refined foods like white flour products and white rice. And in fact, many of these individuals lived in poor countries where they ate mainly white rice. And whereas what you can see is there's a group below this line where they actually had less mortality than the people eating 50 to 55% of calories from carbohydrate. They actually had lower rates. And these were the people eating high fiber, whole food, plant-based diets. And it's, you know, if you look at people in the blue zones, these long-lived people, they actually average 62% of calories from carbohydrates. And there's another group. These are the Tsimane from Bolivia of South America. They live a very traditional hunter-gatherer lifestyle. They have the lowest reported rates of heart disease of any population on the planet. And their average carbohydrate intakes are 72% of calories. They get 14% of calories from protein and 14% of calories from fat. So this really tells us something. Now, one of the things that I think a lot of the carbohydrate naysayers, the people who say carbohydrates are bad, I think they're forgetting something. And I think what they're forgetting is that plant foods, which are the foods with the greatest amounts of antioxidants and fiber and phytochemicals and all of these protective components, are mostly carbohydrates. All plant foods, fruits, vegetables, grains, legumes, and non-starchy vegetables, all plant foods except nuts and seeds contain about 58 to 92% of calories from carbohydrates. Nuts and seeds are only 12%, but essentially most of the vast majority of plant foods are predominantly carbohydrate foods. On the other hand, refined carbohydrates are bad news. So what are refined carbohydrates? Well, these are high carbohydrate foods that have been stripped of most of what is of value to human health before we eat them. and because of food processing. And so we're talking here about refined sugars like table sugar and syrups and jams and jellies and candy, sweetened beverages, all of those things. And then we have refined starches like white flour products, white rice, and concentrated starches. So these are the refined carbohydrate foods that are associated with disease. And the unfortunate thing is that most carbohydrates people eat in North America are refined. And that's why carbohydrates have been painted with this big black brush, because most of the carbohydrates people eat are refined. And refined carbohydrates increase our risk of overeating and obesity, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, insulin resistance and diabetes, high triglycerides, and heart disease. And there was actually an umbrella review of the impact of sugar on health. It just this year just came out. And they looked at over 8,600 articles and 73 meta-analyses. And they found that added sugars have significant harmful associations with 18 endocrine or metabolic outcomes, 10 cardiovascular outcomes, 7 cancer outcomes, and 10 other outcomes. And the authors, as a result, recommended that people reduce free sugars or added sugars to below 25 grams of sugar a day. And that's about 6 teaspoons a day. And you might think 6 teaspoons, that's a lot of sugar, but it's not nearly as much sugar as people actually eat. They also recommended that we limit consumption of sugar-sweetened beverages to less than 1 serving a week. And that's about 7 to 12 ounces per serving. Now, if we look at international and national recommendations for added sugars, the World Health Organization says no more than 10% of calories as added sugar. That's 12 teaspoons in a 2,000 calorie diet. But they add that 5% of calories provides additional health benefit and is really the goal. So that's 6 teaspoons, just like the group that I just talked about recommended. US dietary guidelines are a little more liberal, less than 10% of calories or 12 teaspoons in a 2,000 calorie diet. And then the American Heart Association suggests no more than 6% of calories as added sugars. And that amounts to about 9 teaspoons a day for men and 6 for women. Actually, the American Heart Association also recommends no sugar for children under the age of 2 years. And so what are average intakes? 17 teaspoons a day for adults in the US, and it's even higher for teens. So how much sugar do we get in a typical serving of food? Well, this is the shocker. We get 10 to 13 teaspoons in one 12-ounce can of soda. We get 7 to 18 teaspoons in one large flavored coffee, 9 to 12 in a cup of fruit-flavored yogurt, and 12 in a pastry like a large cinnamon bun. But even foods we don't think of as big sugar sources like energy bars and barbecue sauce and instant oatmeal and other sweetened cereals, we can easily get close to that 6 teaspoon limit in one serving. If you look at the sources of added sugars in the US diet, almost half of our sugar comes from sweet beverages and about 1/3 from sweets and snacks. I mean, if we did nothing else but eliminate sugar from what we drink, we would be pretty much halving our sugar intake. And so it's a similar story for refined starches as well. When we refine grains, for example, I use grains as an example, you take a kernel of wheat. You've got 3 parts to the kernel of wheat. When you refine the wheat, you remove 2 of the 3 parts. You remove the bran, which is the fiber and mineral-rich outer layer, and you remove the germ, which is where most of the nutrients and phytochemicals are stored. And what you're left with when you get the white flour is just endosperm. And endosperm provides carbohydrate, a little bit of protein, but not a whole lot of nutrients. And when we refine wheat into white flour, we lose 80 to 90% of the fiber, 70 to 80% of vitamins and minerals, and 95% of the protective phytochemicals. And of course, nobody eats a bowl of white flour. Before they eat the flour, They add fat and sugar and salt and often food additives, and then they eat the white flour. And therein lies the problem. Not only have we stripped the wheat of everything of value to human health before we eat it, but we've added a bunch of components that we know are associated with increased risk of disease. And then we eat this stuff. And this is a huge issue. On the other hand, whole grains have been found to be healthy foods. There was a 2016 meta-analysis of 45 studies that reported reduced risk of mortality per 3 ounces of whole grain intake. So and that's about 3 servings of grains, really. So a reduction in all-cause mortality of 17%, cardiovascular disease mortality of 22%, diabetes mortality 51%, total cancer 15%, and respiratory mortality 22%. So this is pretty impressive. But I think it's very important for all people who are trying to really fine-tune their diet to be as protective and to be as therapeutic as possible, is to recognize that all whole grains are not created equal. A granola bar doesn't equal a bowl of oatmeal, and a box of flake cereal or like Kamut flakes, even if they're organic, doesn't equal a bowl of Kamut salad, for example. There really is a hierarchy of whole grains, and that hierarchy is determined by the degree of processing of the whole grain. So even whole grains can be processed. At the top of the hierarchy are intact whole grains. So nothing added, nothing removed. The very best of the best would be sprouted intact whole grains. They have even more nutritional value. Then you would have broken whole grains, then rolled like rolled oats, then shredded like shredded wheat, then ground like flour products, whole grain flour products, and then flaked whole grains, and then puffed whole grains. And you notice on this list, there are no refined grains. We're just talking about whole grains here. But as you go down the hierarchy, you're actually increasing the degree of processing. You're increasing the surface area of the grain. You're increasing the rate at which it will be absorbed into your bloodstream. You're exposing the grain to heat and light and oxygen and pressure, and you're destroying nutrients in that process. So if you're wanting to do the best that you can do where whole grains are concerned, you stick to intact whole grains as much as possible, and certainly to the grains at the top end of this hierarchy. So where carbohydrates are concerned, you want to make high fiber whole plant foods your main sources of carbohydrates. You want to minimize all refined carbohydrates or avoid them, both sugars and starches. And you want to avoid added sugars, especially in beverages. Step number 3 is to pick plant protein sources instead of meat. And the reason is really simple. When you go back to those components in food that are really protective, like fiber and phytochemicals and antioxidants and pre and probiotics, legumes, for example, are either high or very high in these compounds, whereas meat contains nothing or very little. When you look at the components that are most pathogenic or harmful to health, they're very low or zero in legumes, and they are either moderate or pretty high in meat. And if you look at mortality studies on legumes, there was a 2023 meta-analysis of 32 cohorts and over 1 million participants, and they reported a 6% drop in mortality for every quarter cup serving of legumes people consumed. So if you ate a whole cup of legumes, that would mean a 24% drop in mortality. This is quite impressive. And there was a study from 2004 that was even more impressive. They looked specifically at people 70 years of age and over, and they reported a 7 to 8% reduction in mortality for every 20 grams or 2 tablespoons consumed. So if people even ate a half cup, it would mean a 28 to 32% reduction in mortality. It's really unbelievable. And if we look at red meat and mortality, we see the exact opposite. It doesn't matter if it's total meat, unprocessed meat, or processed meat. We see the greatest impact with processed meat, between about 13 and 44% increase in mortality risk. And processed meat, we're talking about bacon and ham and lunch meat and sausages and all of those kinds of things. Unprocessed meat, between 5 and 18% increased risk. And then total meat, about 10 to 29% increased risk of mortality. And we've even had a number of studies that have quantified the impact of various animal products. And probably one of the first studies to do that was from 2016. And they followed over 130,000 participants for about 3 decades. And what they found was that even when you replace 3% of calories from animal protein with plant protein. And just to put this in context, 3% of calories in a 2,000 calorie diet is 60 calories. 60 calories is about an ounce of meat, or less than 1 egg, or maybe just a small egg. A large egg is about 78 or 80 calories. And so when what you replace is processed meat, so 3%, 60 calories from processed meat with plant protein, you reduce risk of mortality 34%. When it's eggs, it's 19% risk reduction in mortality. Unprocessed meat, 12%. Milk or other dairy products, 8%. And poultry or fish, it was 6% in this study. Then there was another study from Japan that did the same thing, found replacing only 3% of calories from meat with plant protein. And they had even more stunning results. And they were looking at over 70,000 individuals, again, followed for about 2 decades. Red meat, if you replace 3% of calories from red meat, their mortality dropped 34%. When it was processed meat, mortality dropped 46%. And for cancer, mortality dropped 42% with red meat, and 50% when you replace 3% of calories from processed meat with plant protein sources. And then the most recent study, a 2020 study of over 416,000 participants followed for about 16 years, actually found replacing 3% of animal protein with plant protein reduced overall mortality 10%. And for eggs, it was 24% for men and 21% for women. For red meat, it was 13% for men and 15% for women. For dairy, it was 8% for both. And for white meat, it was 2% for men and 5% for women. So again, pretty impressive. And then finally, another study of over 6,000 individuals, 18-year follow-up. They looked at people that ate high protein diets, like a paleo diet is a high protein diet. People that consume more than 20% of calories from protein had an increase in mortality of 74%. For cancer, it was 433%. That's 4.3 times greater risk of death when you're consuming at least 20% of calories from protein. Diabetes risk was almost 4 times, 393%. But the interesting thing in this study was the associations were abolished or greatly attenuated when the protein came from plants. It was only when the protein came from animal products that we saw these dramatic increases in mortality risk. So what are the most healthful plant protein sources? They are unprocessed or minimally processed legumes like sprouted peas, lentils, and mung beans, cooked legumes, edamame, tofu, tempeh, soy milk, peanuts, peanut butter would be more healthful choices. Unprocessed or minimally processed seeds and nuts, intact whole grains like amaranth, quinoa, kamut berries, and fresh peas would all be good choices. Less healthful choices would be highly processed foods with added fat, sugar, and salt and they have variable impacts on chronic disease risk. In some cases, they can even increase disease risk. So for prevention and reversal, you want to avoid all deep fried foods, even deep fried tofu or tempeh, all deep fried foods, fried veggie meats, highly sweetened dishes with sugary sauces, and you want to limit your intake of veggie meats. You want to look, many are very high in fat and salt. You need to be selective if you use any of them, compare labels, and just use them less often. And any bean dishes with a lot of added sugar, fat, and salt. I want to address the question of soy because this is a big question for a lot of people. Often people wonder if soy messes with hormones, it causes, man boobs and infertility, and people wonder if it might increase the risk of breast cancer. Soybeans are a food that are uniquely rich in something called isoflavones. Traditional soy foods are the most concentrated sources, and I'm talking about edamame, tofu, tempeh, cooked soybeans, soy milk. Those foods are the most concentrated sources of isoflavones. Processed foods made from soy concentrates and isolates contain a fewer or lower amounts of isoflavones. And by that, I'm talking about protein powders and veggie meats, for example. Isoflavones are actually very similar in structure to estrogen, which allows them to bind to estrogen receptors. They're classified as phytoestrogens or plant estrogens. And soy isoflavones tend to preferentially bind to and activate estrogen receptor B rather than estrogen receptor A, and that mimicking the effects of estrogen in some tissues and blocking the effects of estrogen in others. And fortunately, they tend to have anti-estrogenic effects in reproductive tissues, helping to reduce the risk of hormone-related cancers, such as breast, uterine, and prostate cancers. And they tend to have weak estrogenic effects in other tissues, helping to support bone mineral density and to even improve blood lipids. Now, what about soy, man boobs, and infertility? We actually had 2 case studies of individuals who experienced feminizing effects from eating soy, but they were eating 360 milligrams of isoflavones a day. The average serving of any soy food would be about 25 milligrams. So they were averaging 14.4 servings of soy a day. That is excessive, to say the least. We have a 2021 meta-analysis of 41 clinical trials that found no effects of soy or isoflavones on reproductive hormone levels in men. And we have consistent clinical evidence that indicates no adverse effects of soy or soy isoflavones on sperm or semen parameters or the risk of developing gynecomastia, which is man boobs. So what about female hormones and menstrual cycle length? Well, the clinical evidence indicates that neither soy nor isoflavones impact reproductive hormone concentration in women. The evidence regarding impact of soy on menstrual cycle is a little less robust, but generally shows that soy could increase the length of the menstrual cycle by about a day, although ovulation and fertility are not negatively impacted. The normal cycle is 23 to 35 days. So let's say your cycle was typically 28 days. Regular soy intake might increase it to 29 days. And so not a huge deal. What about soy and breast cancer? Well, for years, people believed, and even experts believed, that phytoestrogens in soy could increase risk of breast cancer. Studies have since confirmed that soy is likely protective against breast cancer, especially for people who consumed soy during adolescence or even childhood. There is suggested evidence that soy may also reduce the risk of recurrence or mortality in those who have been diagnosed with breast cancer. And soy may also protect against uterine and prostate cancers, cardiovascular disease, hypertension, kidney disease, bone loss, and cognitive impairment and symptoms of menopause. So that's fairly favorable. And the other thing that's interesting is production is impacted by our dietary patterns. So some of the benefits of isoflavones depend on our gut microbiota. Certain microbes can convert isoflavones to more active forms like daidzein to equal, and only about 25 to 35% of Westerners have the necessary microbes compared to 50 to 60% of Asians or Western vegetarians. And so vegetarian diets actually promote the growth of equal producing bacteria, which is a good thing. And if we look at the blue zones, soy is consumed in 2 blue zones on a daily basis. Loma Linda, California, and the Seventh-day Adventist Vegetarians, and Okinawa, Japan. And in Okinawa, the daily diet is at least 7 servings of vegetables, generous servings of purple flesh sweet potatoes, smaller amounts of rice and grains, a tiny bit of fish, about a half an ounce a day, and 2 servings of soy. So that's the typical Okinawan diet. And so one of the things I often say to people who claim soy is poison is, the acid test to me is to look at the healthiest, longest lived people in the world. It's probably not a poison if it's a staple in 2 out of the 5 blue zones. So where soy is concerned, it's certainly not necessary in a plant-based diet, but it can be a helpful addition. If you do eat soy, you want to select mostly less processed organic soy foods such as edamame, tofu, tempeh, miso, natto, or soy milk. And reasonable intakes are thought to be about 2 to 4 servings for adults and teens, 1 to 2 a day for children. Step 4 is to replace harmful fat with healthful fat. And essentially, you want to make whole plant foods your primary sources of fat. High-fat whole plant foods are rich in fiber and antioxidants and plant sterols and stanols and phytochemicals. And so it makes sense to get most of our fat from that source. Concentrated fats and oils, on the other hand, provide a lot of calories with very few nutrients. And for that reason alone, we want to minimize their intake. They have a very low nutrient density. A tablespoon of oil is 120 calories and almost no nutrients. Whereas if you ate 120 calories worth of nuts or seeds or avocado or olives or edamame or something like that, you'd actually be getting fiber and phytochemicals and all of those things. We want to minimize saturated fat. The American Heart Association recommends under 5 to 6% of calories for heart disease risk reduction. And 5 to 6% of calories is about 13 grams in a 1600 calorie diet. It's about 16 grams in a 2000 calorie diet. If you look at the saturated fat in food, one of the things that you can't help but notice is animal products are very concentrated sources. Just 2 slices of Meat Lover's pizza, 22 grams of saturated fat. You're over the top. You haven't eaten anything else all day. A double cheeseburger, 18 grams. A soft taco with beef and cheese, 16 grams. And even a glass of milk and 2 ounces of cheese would put you over that 16 gram limit for someone eating a 2000 calorie diet. On the other hand, plant foods, even high fat plant foods, are very low in saturated fat. A half of an avocado, about 2 grams. An ounce of nuts or seeds, 1 to 2 grams. Half a cup of tofu or 10 large olives, about a half a gram or just slightly more than that. The only plant foods that are actually high in saturated fat are tropical oils and coconut. You would get about 7 grams of saturated fat in an ounce of coconut. And people wonder, well, should I avoid coconut and coconut oil? It's important to note that about 80 to 90% of the fat in coconut is saturated fat. And in a systematic review, they found that, and this is 7 trials, they found that coconut oil raised LDL cholesterol in all 7 trials, significantly in 6 of them. And the authors noted that the trials found coconut oil raised cholesterol about the same amount as other oils high in saturated fat, such as butter, beef fat, and palm oil. The recommendations are essentially avoid coconut oil, limit fresh or dried coconut. So it doesn't mean you can't ever eat any. If you put a little bit in a granola, it's not terrible, but you wouldn't want to be eating large amounts. Certainly coconut water is completely fat-free, so that can be used on occasion, although of course it contains calories. The other thing you want to do where fat is concerned is minimize your exposure to damaged fats. That means avoid fried and highly processed foods, minimize or avoid oils in cooking. If you ever use oil in cooking, you do not want the oil to smoke. You want to use very low temperatures, and you want to store high-fat foods, including shelled nuts and seeds, in the refrigerator or freezer. You want to optimize your intake of omega-3s. So we're looking at 2 to 4 grams of alpha-linolenic acid per day, and you might want to consider direct sources of EPA and DHA as well. And so, how do you get 2 to 4 grams of alpha-linolenic acid? Well, an ounce of walnuts is 2.6, a tablespoon of chia seeds is 1.8, of ground flax, 1.6, of hemp seeds, a tablespoon is 1. Now, leafy greens, about half the fat is omega-3, but they don't have much fat. So you would have to eat 20 to 40 cups of them to get to meet your needs for omega-3 fatty acids. Now, microalgae-based supplements, some people do not convert ALA to EPA and DHA very well. That's especially true for people with diabetes and hypertension. So EPA, DHA, microalgae-based supplements may be well advised, and generally 200 to 300 milligrams a day are recommended. Some people need more to get their levels to where they need to be. Step number 5 is to maximize phytochemicals and antioxidants. The wider the range of vegetables, fruits, legumes, whole grains, nuts, and seeds in the diet, the greater the variety and content of phytochemicals and antioxidants. You want to think color. The richest sources are often the most colorful. So to maximize protective phytochemicals and antioxidants, you want to choose purple instead of white onions, black instead of brown rice, dark instead of light greens, just as examples. You want to eat a whole rainbow of vegetables and fruits. When I make a big salad, I try to get something from every part of the rainbow, something red, something orange, something yellow, something green, and something purple blue. I aim for at least 3 green, 2 orange yellow, 2 pink red, 1 purple blue, and 1 white beige every day. You want to make dark leafy greens a daily staple, having them at least 1 or 2 meals a day. You want to eat more raw foods. Raw foods contain enzymes that convert certain phytochemicals into their active metabolites. So, for example, myrosinase in cruciferous vegetables helps to convert glucosinolates into the more active form called isothiocyanates, like sulforaphane, which is a potent anti-carcinogen. And allanase from allium vegetables like garlic and onions helps to convert allan to the active form allicin. Raw foods do even more than that. Raw foods are generally higher in phytochemicals. They retain nutrients often lost in cooking, especially water-soluble nutrients like B vitamins and vitamin C. They contain fewer products of oxidation caused by high-temperature cooking. And raw foods are unprocessed. They don't contain the potentially harmful food additives, refined starches, sugars, solid fats that processed foods contain. The other thing we can do is to start sprouting, because when you sprout foods, the phytochemical army that's poised to protect that new little delicate plant multiplies by 5 to 50 times. You also want to pile on the herbs and spices, because these are some of the most concentrated sources of antioxidants and phytochemicals per gram or per weight in the diet. Drink antioxidant-rich teas like hibiscus tea and green tea and matcha and ginger and turmeric teas and chamomile and so forth. Step 6 is to minimize dietary contaminants. And the worst offenders are environmental contaminants, the byproducts of high temperature cooking, and food additives. So environmental contaminants are things like pesticides in conventional produce, mercury in fish and seafood, arsenic in rice, chicken, fish, and seaweed. And POPs are persistent organic pollutants like PCBs and DDT and dioxins in fish and meat and dairy products. The solutions here are to choose organic when you can. And the Environmental Working Group has a nice little document that helps you to, if you can't afford to get everything organic, they put out a list of the dirty dozen. These are the foods most concentrated in pesticides, and the clean 15, the foods that have the lowest amounts of pesticides. And so you can buy within the clean 15 non-organic options if you can't buy everything organic, and try to stick to organic in the dirty dozen. You can also eat lower on the food chain, which means eat more plants. You want to be your grains. Inorganic arsenic can cause cancer and increase the risk of diabetes and cardiovascular disease. So you want to eat a wide variety of grains. And if you do eat rice as a staple, you want to cook it in a large amount of water and drain it. And we're talking about 6 to 10 times more water than rice, and then just drain it. The other thing is to, purchase rice from California as opposed to some of the other states and the South that may contain more arsenic. The soil may contain more arsenic. Now, the products of high temperature cooking, we're looking at heterocyclic amines, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, acrylamide, and advanced glycation end products. And these all can, they are pro-inflammatory. They can increase oxidative stress, increase risk of cancer, and so forth. And heterocyclic amines are most concentrated in grilled meats. Heterocyclic amines are not found in plant foods at all, because you need creatine or creatinine to produce heterocyclic amines. So that's only in meat and eggs and animal products. Polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons will form in anything that blackens. So any dark brown or black foods that are cooked to dark brown or black will contain polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons. Acrylamide is most concentrated in potato products that have been fried, like potato chips, whether they're regular potato chips or sweet potato chips, doesn't matter. And then advanced glycation end products are most concentrated in foods that are cooked, but mainly processed meats like bacon and wieners, for example. The solutions here: avoid charred or blackened foods, especially meat, poultry, or fish. Avoid fried foods. Use moist cooking methods most of the time, like steaming, stewing, boiling, water sauteing. They all produce fewer products of oxidation. And then with food additives, often highly processed foods have food additives to enhance flavor, color, and shelf life. Well, they're not all harmful. It's best to limit food additives, and in some cases, we want to steer clear. Artificial food colors are used to make foods acceptable to consumers. We've already banned red dyes number 1, 2, and 4. We still use red dye number 3, even though it's been linked to behavioral problems and cancer. Red dye 40, yellow, and 5 and 6 dyes may affect attention in children and are potential carcinogens. Sodium nitrates are used to add flavor and color to meat to prevent the growth of mold, fungus, and bacteria. And when meat is heated to high temperature or exposed to stomach acid, the sodium nitrate is converted to nitrosamines, which are linked to cancer. Sulfates are used to preserve the color of dried fruits, vegetables, sauerkraut, etc. And they're not a problem for everyone, but some people who are sensitive, it can have adverse effects from sulfites. And the solutions here are to eat whole foods and avoid highly processed foods. Highly processed foods with added fat, sugar, and salt mess with the appetite control center and make it hard to stop eating. So our final step is to meet needs for all essential nutrients. Even if you do everything right, it's possible to fall short of essential nutrients. We want to get all the macronutrients we need, the carbohydrates, the protein, and the fat, especially essential fatty acids, and the micronutrients, vitamins, and minerals. And we to ensure adequate intakes, we need to be aware that plant-based eaters tend to have higher intakes of folate, vitamin C, K, E, iron, potassium, magnesium, and copper, although iron is less well absorbed, so it also deserves some attention. Nutrients that are most commonly falling short in plant-based diets are vitamin B12, calcium, vitamin D, iodine, zinc, choline, and omega-3 fatty acids. So we need to provide regular sources, either from food or supplements. We want most of it from foods, but if we can't get enough, especially if we're on a calorically restrictive diet, so we're limiting our calories, we may want to take a high quality organic vegan multivitamin mineral supplement. And we can use a plant-based food guide. This is one from a book I wrote called Nourish. And it just helps people to know every meal you want to be having something from each food group. And it indicates as well the nutrients that may be low in a plant-based diet. So our take-home message is every time you eat or drink, You either feed disease or you fight disease. Well-designed whole food plant-based diets provide a powerful and effective means of fighting disease. So I'm going to end my presentation by telling you the rest of the story about my dad. So it was probably about 2 years after that interaction I told you about with my dad happened that my dad had a stroke when he was at work, and he was taken to the emergency, and his blood pressure was 220 over 110. His blood sugar was over 500 milligrams per deciliter. And he was told that if he didn't stop smoking, he would die within 3 months. And if he did, he might live 3 years. And I will never forget, being in my dad's room when the doctor told him that. And we were both crying. And I remember my dad saying to me, what was I thinking? I don't want to die. He said, I want to grow old with my sweetheart. I want to dance at our 50th wedding anniversary. I want to watch my grandchildren grow up. How could I have been so stupid? And it was at this point that it was like he got hit over the head, and he realized that without his health, he has no freedom. You don't have freedom when you're attached to a dialysis machine, which he was for 11 years, by the way. My dad never made huge changes in his lifestyle, but he made the change from bacon and eggs to oatmeal and blueberries and flaxseed. He started to exercise. He made enough changes that he did dance at their 50th wedding anniversary, and I'm very grateful for that. My dad passed away about 11 years ago. I have made it a mission to try to help people avoid, the diseases that are so entirely preventable. And with that, I'll say thank you very much, and I will stop my share and be happy to take any questions that you might have.